I'm going to be knitting today on the Brother KH587. This is quite an old machine and it has some unique features, but we're going to start with the absolute basics because I have run into the fact that people really don't know this, and if this is your first machine, it's the difference between success and failure. This yarn is appropriate to the machine, as it is to all standard gauge machines. This one, which is thicker, is also appropriate. This one is absolutely not. I know that it looks thin. People, sometimes I ask them if they're using the right yarn, and they say, oh, it's very thin. It is by modern standards, but it is not suitable to a standard gauge machine. These yarns are labeled numbers 1 and 2 by the manufacturer these days, and they are what knits well on a standard gauge machine. Sometimes experienced knitters manage also number 0 and number 3, but honestly 1 and 2 are where you want to start. A coned yarn is ideal. This is the end of a cone of yeoman yarn. But if you need to use something from the craft store, this is one of the few that does it. I've rewound it on my Nancy's winder, and this kind of a ball knits nicely on the knitting machine. It pulls from the center. This is Michael's, I think the official name is Loops and Thread, and it is called Wool-like. It is not wool, it's a nice acrylic. And so if you want local yarn to try out your new machine, I would look for this one. Now let's look at some basics, how the yarn mast inserts. See those little tabs? There are notches in this slot, front and back, and the tabs slide into those notches. On up the mast, you find this yarn carrier guide. This one is bent. We're going to need to repair it. I'm not going to bother with that right this minute because I'm not going to use it with my yarn sitting right on the table. Sometimes I find that feeding directly up to here is what works the best. Now I'm going to attempt to stand up and show you how to thread the yarn through the mast. If you were going through the yarn carriers here, we would stick them out and you would do so. But I'm going to put my yarn supply on the shelf. There's a little bar. You come above that bar, then between two tension discs, doing it again so you can get another look. Then between the notches of this slot, and you just press up and there's an opening that gets you into that hole. Now I'm pulling down the spring wire and popping the yarn into the opening. That just slides in very easily. Now I'm ready to thread the machine. Now we'll take a look at the carriage and prepare to cast on. First of all, we've got to decide on stitch size. That's the dial that I'm spinning around. Larger numbers are bigger stitches. Small numbers are teeny weeny stitches. I'm going to use that blue yarn, and it should probably knit well somewhere near the middle of the dial. My initial estimate is size 6. See the little arrow pointing to 6? That's what I'm going to try first. There are buttons on each side of the carriage labeled 1, 2, and 3. Normally to cast on, I place both in the 1 position. And up here is a knob we'll look more at later, but we just need it set for normal knitting right now, which is a little mysterious on this machine. There you can see it, because it has Japanese characters. But I'm going to use the all the way up position. Working from memory, I may have to correct myself, but I think that's our normal knitting position. Now I'm going to tell you a little secret. There is a cast on in the manual for this machine, and it's the cast on that I like least, and I rarely use it. So I'm going to show you some different ones. Usually they begin with a loop of yarn knotted into your yarn supply. In this case, I'm going to hang that loop on the left needle The carriage is sitting off to my right. You will soon see it. And I'm going to make the cursive letter E around every successive needle. Make your E's not too loose and not too tight, and use the thumb of your other hand to grab them so they don't try to unwind. That's the easiest way. Now we're ready to thread the carriage and cast on. My yarn is continuing over from my last letter E under the sinker plate, that's this. Slide it into that central slot and make sure to go under the spring. Make sure that it slides to and fro easily and yet doesn't want to come out. When I go side to side, I know it's seated properly if it stays in there where it belongs. This machine has a spring sort of thing, a little wire loop down in there. And sometimes your yarn doesn't want to go around that loop and actually pop into the hole. So you just saw me manually make that happen. I am not sure how well you're going to be able to see, but I'm going to try to position this in the zoom. There's a little round hole at the very bottom, which should be the eventual position of the yarn. And if it is not, it will pop out of place without warning. I think what I'll do is knit now and show you that position with the sinker plate off of the machine again. Only one weight came with this machine, and I'm going to advise the owner to buy herself some additional ones. You always need to have at least 2 on hand. But for right now, I'm going to see if her one weight hung in the center will be enough to allow us to knit, because after all, this is a skinny little piece of knitting we're doing. Doing nicely. And I can tell I've picked a pretty good stitch size because it's not giving me any trouble to knit. In a minute, I can decide whether I just would prefer the fabric looser or tighter. So let's keep going. Here's what we're getting. I'll see if I can zoom so you can see it better. I think that's pretty good, just the way it is. If it were difficult to knit, I would assume that I probably needed to loosen the stitch. If I could see my finger through the fabric very well, I would probably need to tighten the stitch. But it looks like my estimate was pretty good here. So back to knitting. Now I think I will bind off this piece and cast on again for you using a different technique. Bind offs are in a completely other video for all machines, and I'm not going to try to do it right here because I'm set up so I can't actually get between the camera and the machine. I would be in your way. So let me just bind off privately and you'll look at another video for that. Okay, here's a new cast on. This one's going to use a latch tool. This is not the tool that came with the machine. This is one of my private collection, but it works just like the one that came with it. I'm starting with a loop as usual, but I'm going to crochet a chain using my latch tool, working around the needle shanks. You can work from the top or from the bottom. It's easier for me to film it and stay out of your way using the latch tool from the bottom and feeding the yarn from the top. We are simply crocheting a chain, and just as with the E-wraps, it needs to be loose enough that it won't be difficult to knit through. When I get to the last needle, I'll take my existing loop, hang it on that needle, tighten it up, then go over here and thread the machine just as I did before. And you already know that I'm going to be double checking out of your vision to make sure that my yarn is correctly positioned. I'm enlarging the stitch size to 7 this time because when I got my fabric off the machine, it was perfectly nice, but it was fabric such as you would use for a sock. Here's my swatch. Quite firm, no light through it. That's great for some things. For a sweater, I would like a little bit more drape and looseness. Therefore, I would go up to stitch size 7, which I'm going to try now. And again, we're in position 1, and we knit across, and the machine will knit back to normal position. Bringing these needles forward. And one more time for safety. One thing sometimes people ask is, do you have to have the latches open? And you do not, because the carriage has a feature, usually magnets inside of it, that automatically open the latches. So they need to be open, but they don't have to be opened by you. And we're off again. Let's increase. If we place 1 needle in work on this side, the carriage should make a loop of yarn around it and then begin knitting it normally after that. This is called a simple increase. And you see how every row, the newly formed stitch has been incorporated and begun to make a real stitch. But see these little loops on the edge? They are an essential feature that is always going to happen with a simple increase. So I will show you 1 or 2 times a fancier increase called the full fashion increase. We move the outer stitch out. And we go to the purl bump, which is that right there, from the next stitch over and the row below, and hang it on the needle that was empty. Let me move the camera a little bit, and then you'll be able to see me do that on the left. This takes looking very closely at what you're picking up. I'm leaving the original stitch on this needle and picking up the top of the stitch, otherwise known as the purl bump, from the row below. Having a little trouble grabbing hold of it, but there it is, got it. Lift it, flip it onto the needle. These things like placing stitches on needles. That one was a little tight. It didn't knit off properly. I could see a loop, but I can fix it by causing it to manually knit, and no one will ever know the difference. So let's knit on for a minute. Now let's do some simple decreasing. Let's do 1 on each side. Edge stitch, moved in. So there are 2 needles on the new end needle. 2 stitches. I said needles, didn't mean it. Let's knit 2 rows. And do that again. This is called the simple decrease, for the obvious reason that it's the simplest, most basic way. But you can decrease. Now, if you're going to seam your piece, say this was the side of a sweater and we were working on an armhole, you can see what's going to happen that you might not like. Where there are 2 loops on the needle, it'll knit them off nicely, but it's going to be hard to figure out what to pick up to create a nice seam. On those occasions, all we have to do is do what's called a full fashioned decrease. There are other names for it elsewhere in the world, but that's the most common. We pick up 2 edge stitches and only move them in 1 needle position. So now the doubled stitch is on needle 2 from each edge. That leaves you the needle 1 position, the very edge stitch for neat seaming. It's not necessary to do it on some things, because if they're not going to be seamed, you may like the effect that the simple decrease has. Also, if you're using cut and sew methods along with what you're doing, it may negate the whole advantage of any change in methodology. But it's good to know this, and if you want to, you can move in 3 stitches or even 4, 5, 6 and more and make it a fashion note, basically, because this stitch where the decrease occurs, it does show as a column that's different from the rest. It makes a little line. So if I did it, well, I will do it way over into it and you'll see it. Let's try this next time. I'm going to move 4 stitches in. And since I only have a 2-prong tool, I'll do them 2 and 2, but the effect is just the same. Now the doubled stitch is here. Let's do the same thing again. Move 2 in, resettle them. While resettling stitches, you do have to make sure the latches are open because the carriage can't do it for you. And I've just been reading across with my eyes and spotting that they were open enough. But if one was not, you would need to put your tool up and flick it open like that. If I do that one more time, when we get the swatch off, you should be able to see the line that it traces and see why it can add a unique little look to the garment. Let's flip this work up. You can see the shape, widest between my fingers, much narrower. You can see the full fashion decreases in this area, leaving a clean edge stitch, and the decreases are running here. But where I move them in, you can see that line there. I'm going to twist and turn this so it catches the light in different ways to make sure that's something you can spot. And by now, if you have an experienced eye, it shows on the back along here too. If you're not really seeing what I'm talking about, don't be dismayed. That's because you're not yet used to looking at it. You will. Here we go. Let's look at the difference here. These are the loops where I did the simple increase. And you can see they stopped occurring where I changed to the full fashion increase. Quite a difference.